Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to our conference. My name is Professor Jerry McGill. I'm the chair of the conference. And I welcome our streaming community. The conference is going out live streaming globally. And even for people whose time chart in different continents doesn't quite mesh, the presentations go virtually immediately onto our website for video, so people can watch at a different time. A very special welcome to Central Catholic High School. The students and teachers have come to join our conference today. They've got their presentations or posters displayed next door, and at the breaks the students will be there to help explain the posters to you, so it's a great honour to have you. Thank you all, Central Catholic, for being here. And President Gormley gave a special welcome to them last night. It's my privilege now to introduce our new Provost of the University, David Dowsey, who's going to give you some welcome remarks.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Duquesne University. It's really an honor for me to be able to kick off our second day of the Integrity of Creation Conference. I'd like to personally thank the conference presenters, organizers, and attendees for making this event such a special event every year that we have it. As you know, this is an interdisciplinary conference focused on civil discourse around a particular theme. This year, our theme is Global Sustainability Challenge. And what a challenge it is. After a welcome last night from President Gormley, we kicked off the conference with a wonderful presentation by Paul Shrivastava focused on global sustainability in an era of significant human impact on the Earth's ecosystems and geology. We continue those discussions today with an excellent slate of speakers who will discuss everything from environmental ethics in China to sustainability in Paraguay. The global and interdisciplinary nature of this conference highlights not only the size and scale of this challenge, but also the fact that we need all hands on deck if we are to solve this particular challenge. We need to find a sustainable path forward for our children and our grandchildren. We live in this interconnected world where decisions are made in mass consumption societies, those societies that make a disproportionate or have a disproportionate value on consumption and consumerism, and I should note that the United States is chief among them. And they can have tremendous ripple effects on the rest of the global ecosystem and the rest of the world. The most negative effects are often felt by those who are on the margins of society and who have no voice or say in decisions that are being made that dramatically impact their life and their livelihood. Duquesne University was founded by the Spirit and congregation who have a deep and profound reverence towards the natural world and its interdependent nature. Duquesne is dedicated to finding new ways to reduce consumerism, consumption, and to promote a sustainable living, especially to those individuals who are most in need. This conference is one of the many ways in which we promote sustainability. We also have a variety of other ways that we do it, including one of the best sustainability MBA programs in the world. It's an honor to be able to host this conference. We are grateful to all of you for your good work in this area and look forward to working with you to develop a sustainable future. Thank you.
Thank you, Provost Dowsey. That was a very nice start of our day. Thank you for inspiring us to having lovely conversation as we go forward. It is my honour now to introduce to you Professor Jennifer Bates, who is a professor in the Department of Philosophy, who will then introduce our speaker. Jennifer?
Hi. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Sarah Fredericks. She is an assistant professor of environmental ethics at the University of Chicago Divinity School. Professor Fredericks' research focuses on sustainability, sustainable energy, environmental guilt and shame, and environmental justice. Her work draws upon pragmatic and comparative religious ethics. She is the author of a book, Measuring and Evaluating Sustainability, Ethics in Sustainability Indexes. and articles in many journals, the Journal for the Study of Religion, Nature and Culture, International Journal of Sustainable Development and World Ecology, Environmental Justice and Ethics and Policy and Environment. She co-edits a book series, Religious Ethics and Environmental Challenges, with Kevin O'Brien. Dr. Fredericks, along with colleagues from 3 other universities, was recently awarded a grant from the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation-funded Humanities Without Walls, a consortium that funds cross-institutional teams researching topics in the humanities. Their project, Being Human in the Age of Humans, Perspectives from Religion and Ethics, seeks to facilitate research on the Anthropocene within religious studies, theology, and ethics. Dr. Fredericks' talk is entitled, Thinking at the Margins of Sustainability in Religious Ethics, Indicators, Emotions, Rituals. Please join me in warmly welcoming her.
Excuse me for just a second. Okay. Good morning. Thank you, Professor Bates, for the introduction, and to Professors McGill and Sheed for the invitation, as well as to Ms. Smith for her behind-the-scenes organizational work, and to all of the many people who have labored to make this event possible. I'm honored to be included as a speaker. When I think about what religious ethics can bring to the study of sustainability and initiatives to move toward more sustainable societies, I find myself drawn to the edges of scholarship, to the topics that relatively few people think about, but that can still have an impact on sustainability initiatives. Many scholars of religion and religious leaders have to date emphasized arguments about why people should care about sustainability from the basis of one religious tradition or another, or how religious people are aiding or sometimes hindering sustainability movements because of their religious commitments. Now, these studies are incredibly important, both to understand how religions and the environment can and do relate, and in many cases to help motivate environmental action. I'm fortunate to be able to work with people doing this type of work and build on their scholarship. But I'm going to talk today about some other kinds of contributions that religious ethics can make to sustainability. Today I'd like to talk about 2 that have been the focus of my major research projects to date. The first involves using ethics to improve our measurements of progress towards sustainability, to ensure that what we measure and therefore what we promote is actually what is sustainable and something that is a desirable future. The second involves recognizing that emotions, particularly shame, can hinder sustainability efforts, and that rituals are necessary to deal with the shame many people rightly feel about their participation in environmental degradation. So after a brief discussion of sustainability, I'll focus on each of these contributions in turn. So as we heard last night, sustainability is frequently conceived as having 3 dimensions: the environmental, economic, and social, where the environmental includes all of the physical conditions of the world. We might think of things like species extinction rates, or air, water, and soil quality, or the Earth's temperature in a time of global warming. The economic dimension recognizes that human economic activities have significant effects on the larger environment and human society. And in our world, the economy is critical to our sustainability efforts. The third dimension, the social, encompasses all sorts of elements of human society, such as human health and well-being, education, culture, religion, etc. It's important to note that most sustainability advocates don't see it as a fixed target that everybody should be aiming toward one thing that is sustainability, Rather, it's a target that varies depending on the ecosystem, the society, and the economy, all of which are in flux and mutually influence each other. Now, given this temporal dimension to sustainability and the influence of economics on early sustainability literature, the most widely used definition in this conversation is that of sustainable development from Our Common Future, or the Brundtland Report, a 1987 document, meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, in 1992, at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro, Agenda 21, a blueprint or an action plan for sustainability, was endorsed by over 170 nations. This non-binding policy document encouraged non-governmental organizations, corporations, and governmental bodies from the local to the national level to work towards sustainability. Particularly, Agenda 21 encouraged people to delineate goals of sustainability and to measure their progress toward these goals. Why? Well, it was assumed that whether you're giving money and time and resources to a nonprofit, or whether you're interested in what your government or corporation is doing, you might want to know, are your efforts going in a direction that you want? Is the money being well spent? Are things getting better? Thus, post-1992, there was a wealth of scholars who turned their attention to monitoring progress towards sustainability. These efforts are known as indicators and indexes. These are methods that are often quantitative of assessing the state of a complex system. Now, all of you are familiar with indicators. If you were here last night, you heard a lot of examples, but you're also familiar with them in your everyday life. For example, heart rate, blood pressure, and percent body fat are common indicators of a person's health. Sets of sustainability indicators for cities or nations track environmental, economic, and social indicators, such as levels of air pollution, GDP, or life expectancy. By monitoring these indicators over time, one can hopefully determine whether the system in question is changing for better or for worse, and possibly whether new policies, such as a new air pollution law, has been effective. Now, indexes, a term I'll be using throughout the morning as well, are aggregations of indicators in a single number, graph, or symbol. Both indicators and indexes have the potential to shape policy and action, since people tend to pay attention to what is monitored. We see this every day in people who wear Fitbits on their wrist, trying to count their steps to get in shape. But indicators and indexes are not used just for information, but as the basis of funding allocation and to assess what policies work best. We see this increasingly in our educational systems, as what is measured in standardized tests can shape what students study when they're doing homework, how teachers teach, and how teachers are evaluated. Similar trends can happen with sustainability indexes, as companies, governments, nonprofits, and individuals may change their behavior to improve their index score, and maybe their funding or their prestige or other benefits. Now, as an ethicist encountering these indexes, I found myself wondering what kind of ethic is embedded in the indexes. What ethics are driving these goals? And indeed, whether the measurements that people take align with their stated visions of sustainability. After all, a misalignment between index measurements and values can push action plans well away from what is ultimately desired. For instance, if a workforce values creative problem solving, but consistently evaluates students based on their memorization of terminology and dates, it's unlikely that those students will develop the creative problem solving skills that the workforce desired. Similarly, environmental policy can push actions away from various values if they're not intentionally lined up with measurements at the beginning. In the early 2000s, when I began this research, sustainability indicators were really taking off, and I hope to be able to make some interventions in the field to help make sure that indicators were well aligned with ethics well before they became codified and then were difficult to change. So to do this, I first had to ask what values, if any, are presumed in the sustainability movement. I found that definitions of sustainability and the movement in general have always blended technical and normative elements. The technical includes what can be sustained in a particular ecosystem, business, neighborhood, etc. And the normative includes what the authors of the document consider acceptable or desirable to be sustained. To illustrate this point, let me note that one way to curb carbon emissions to slow climate change would be to kill off most humans. After all, if we only had maybe 1% of the human population, all things being equal, we probably wouldn't have a problem with climate change. But you chuckle because this is not a solution that is morally acceptable to the vast number of people. So the way that we set our sustainability targets is intimately connected to what we see as valuable, possible, morally acceptable, to the vision that we want for our society, our world, ourselves, our children, grandchildren, etc. So while this example of killing people off is extreme, we find such normative assumptions throughout the sustainability literature. We not only find it in documents of religious organizations thinking about sustainability, but also in business mission statements, in textbooks for classes on sustainable energy or environmental engineering or something like this. We see it in policy documents. It's really everywhere. For example, just to come back to our definition here of sustainable development from the Brundtland Report, here we see a definition that's talking about meeting the needs of people alive today, intra-generational justice, and people meeting the needs both of people today and in the future, intergenerational justice. Agenda 21 elaborated on this basic commitment to justice as it promoted the equitable access to physical resources and the political process with respect to a variety of groups of people, including women, children, the poor, people in developing countries, and indigenous populations. Thus, we see these major international policy documents as advocating both intra and intergenerational justice and also distributive justice, about an equitable distribution of goods and services between people, as well as participatory justice, a justice that enables all people affected by particular decisions to participate in that decision-making process. Later international documents on sustainability continued this trend, as does literature throughout the sustainability movement. At the same time, as I've argued in measuring and evaluating sustainability, many religious and philosophical systems of ethics and grassroots environmental movements also prioritize justice. Indeed, my research argues that justice, inter- and intra-generational, distributive, and participatory, are the most common values of the sustainability movement. So it seems that this is a good place to start evaluating sustainability metrics. Do they align with justice, the most important value? If not, we've got a problem. So to answer this question, I analyzed a number of indexes and indicator sets applicable to different parts of sustainability and at very different ranges. What I found was, while all of the documents surrounding these indicators, their mission statements, their goals, etc., talked about justice, there's no guarantee that the indicators themselves actually monitored justice well when the rubber hit the road. Indeed, my research has indicated that sustainability indexes are most likely to fall short of the principle of justice, the very ethic that they primarily claim to support. Now, it is the case that sustainability indicators and indexes do embody a commitment to justice in at least a basic way. Decreasing air and water pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and the generation of toxic wastes are all activities frequently monitored by indexes, and they lessen the environmental effects experienced by humans and biota, current and future generations. Environmental degradation typically affects the most vulnerable people most because it's often worst in places where people have little money or political power, where people don't have the resources to move away or mitigate its effects, and because vulnerable groups such as children, the elderly, or chronically ill experience more health impacts from environmental degradation. So given these trends, you might say, oh, well, decreasing pollution or slowing climate change in general, these will improve the lot of everyone, so the indicators are on target. Well, they are in a general degree, but this assumption presumes a trickle-down effect of environmentalism, which may not actually occur. Grandfather clauses in environmental laws often let the most egregious sources of pollution continue unchecked for decades, even as new facilities have stricter standards. Communities living near a plant then will continue to be affected even if the average pollution levels for the nation decrease. This can, in fact, exacerbate the discrepancy between environmental harms of the worst off and the average person. In short, average data that usually monitored in these indexes can only tell us so much about particulars. So for example, if you look at indicators of water quality in the US, it will say that we are doing great. But I don't think the people of Flint, Michigan would agree. Okay. Unfortunately, data limitations often prevent indicator lists and indexes from exploring these different experiences of benefits and burdens. When detailed studies about environmental injustices are done, they tend to be quite limited spatially or temporally to one city, 1 year, or they focus on one particular problem, such as proximity to toxic waste facilities. Now, to lessen the burden of data collection while still improving the alignment of indexes with ethical priorities, at least 4 steps could be taken. 1, distributive justice issues could be addressed through more in-depth studies of representative vulnerable populations. So we could focus in on people who were most vulnerable and argue, rather than looking at the average, we should focus on them. If they're doing better, then presumably others will as well. Number 2, we could monitor locally specific indicators to help ensure that the environmental, social, and economic challenges of particular communities aren't obscured by overall goals. For instance, an indicator that monitors whether it's safe to eat local fish, a matter of cultural and dietary importance for many people, may be a more important sustainability indicator for those particular communities than other indicators like air pollution or species extinction rates. Other culturally specific environmental priorities, such as the ability to worship at sacred outdoor sites, participate in outdoor recreation, or even see a particular mountain or landscape through the smog, have also been monitored in recent years to get at those culturally specific priorities. These types of indicators aim to ensure that what matters to the people being studied is actually measured and sustained, rather than only prioritizing an expert view of the good life that can prioritize certain developmental paths or cultural traditions. Third, we can increase qualitative data through surveys or interviews. I'm not going to say a lot about that today. If you have questions, we can talk about it in the Q&A. And fourth, all of these suggestions will be aided by community participation. So asking local participants what kinds of things they value and how we could monitor that. This will help increase participatory justice, highlight the ethical expertise of index users, increase buy-in to sustainability initiatives, and ensure that indexes and indicators are better understood and thus less likely to be misconstrued. Of course, we need to realize in all of this conversation that indexes are always going to be limited. They're by nature simplifying incredibly complex systems into very small bits of information. Thus, whenever we're using them, we need to remain vigilant about their ethical limitations, as well as the limitations in the processes of developing them. When these sorts of steps are taken, then indicators for sustainability can nicely inform decision-making processes in households, local governments, nonprofits, and corporations in ways that align with the ethical priorities of their users. Without explicit attention to ethics, however, in the development of indexes and indicators, there's no guarantee that they're going to line up, and indeed these indicators and the policies that surround them may force our actions away from what is sustainable in a technical and normative sense. Thus, paying attention to the ethics of sustainability measurements is critical to making progress towards sustainability. In this analysis, I focused on a particular kind of barrier to sustainability initiatives, the lack of knowledge. Namely, if we don't acknowledge our ethics and figure out how to monitor our progress towards sustainability well, we won't make any progress. This general focus on overcoming a lack of knowledge as a key to sustainability is very common in the literature. Frequently, people want just one more study in hopes it will give a definitive answer to a horribly complicated problem. Sustainability experts from many fields often think people would get on board if they only had the facts. If people just knew the consequences of flying or eating meat or using plastics, then certainly they would change their actions. Thus, we see educational campaigns are often a significant element of environmental initiatives. We see similar trends in religion and ecology studies and religious environmental activism. People try to get the word out about anthropogenic or human-caused environmental degradation and why people should care, based on the tenets of one religious tradition or another. Often we see an assumption that if people learned a new story or recognized that their tradition had environmental roots or had access to a robust set of environmental ethical principles, then they'd be converted. They'd believe, think, and act differently. Now, don't get me wrong. Knowledge is incredibly important, and it can be a catalyst for change beliefs and practices. But it's not sufficient. If all it took was knowing what we should do to do the right thing, our world would be a different place. There wouldn't be any criminals. There wouldn't be any wrongdoing. You'd just do it. Religious traditions from around the world recognize the fact that humans are limited in the degree to which we live up to what we think is right. Indeed, grappling with what it means to be human and how we should act in the face of it is a central question of many traditions. Think of Buddhists recognizing that attachment is the root of suffering. In the Christian tradition, just for one of many examples, think of Augustine's reflection on why he stole his neighbor's pears even when he knew it was wrong. Attachment, lack of will, and sin are just a few ways to describe how sustainability efforts, and indeed any effort, can be hindered by a lack of knowledge. Religious traditions have many resources to conceptualize and deal with human finitude. More work is needed here with respect to sustainability. Today, I'd like to focus on one segment of response to human limitations, the emotional responses of guilt and shame and their ramifications for the person experiencing them and for their larger world. So I'll define these emotions, talk about how they manifest with respect to the environment, why shame is dangerous, and the ways that religions are very well suited to deal with these problems. So we'll start with some definitions from social psychology, catalyzed by the work of Helen Block Lewis and exemplified in the contemporary work of June Price Tanguy and her colleagues. Now, following Block Lewis, guilt and shame are self-conscious moral emotions. They're grounded in a judgment about the behavior the actor has done or failed to do and deems wrong. Extensive empirical research through journaling, studies, surveys, and interviews suggests that people often differentiate such emotions by the locus of judgment, either on the problematic action, I stole something, or on one's whole global self, what it reveals to me about myself that I stole something. Okay? So look what I did in the case of guilt, or look what I did in the case of shame. Often, both guilt and shame are present in particular situations, and they can be difficult to differentiate, but this is one way to do it. When we're looking at this research, we also see that guilt tends to be shorter term, quicker released, whereas whereas shame tends to linger because it's about your whole self. It's more difficult to imagine getting over it. Scholars also argue that guilt tends to lead toward reparative action, whether you are making an apology, you're cooperating, you're compromising, whereas shame tends to lead to hiding, withdrawing, denying, running away, or anger, all things that then are unlikely to make you want to apologize or take steps to right the wrong. Now, this division between guilt related to discrete actions and shame to an assessment of the self plays out in the environmental arena as well. To support these claims, I'd like to give you some evidence about the experiences of guilt and shame in contemporary America in particular. There's been some academic research done on this to date, but I've really done a lot of the work to gather this evidence. In doing so, I've looked at the social, psychological, and marketing research, as well as thousands of pieces of evidence from popular environmental literature. This comes from blogs and discussion boards. It comes from environmental memoirs like I Killed a Penguin or Confessions of an Eco-Sinner. It comes from major news articles, from TV shows like Modern Family, from comics, the rise of counseling on the topic, etc. I really find this evidence in many, many places in American society. Now, people feeling guilt and shame feel it about all kinds of things. Riding on airplanes, driving cars, using fossil fuels, eating fast food rather than organics, and forgetting their cloth bags when they go to the grocery store, one of the most talked about categories. They're concerned about these actions because of the direct and indirect harms they cause to people, other biota, and possibly ecosystems or the planet. Some are also concerned about these actions because they consider them disrespectful to God or the interconnected nature of all beings. Now, I'd like to look at one or two pieces of evidence, and recognizing that environmental issues in general can be a bit depressing and guilt and shame can bring up all kinds of things for people, I'd like to start with a comic. Now, this comic wasn't necessarily made to be projected, so let me read it for you. It's called Eco-Self-Consciousness, the feeling of guilt, shame, and remorse for failing to bring your own reusable bags to the grocery store. We see this woman freaked out with her huge eyes as the checker has clearly just said, "Do you need a bag or did you bring your own?" And she replies, "I was using my bags to pick organic strawberries from my sustainable garden. I left them in my other car, it's Prius, while I was busy helping underprivileged children install solar panels." Okay, so she's freaking out about her experiences and what this reflects about her. She's justifying her identity to this grocery store checker. The fact that some of you laugh indicate that you recognize this kind of behavior either in yourself or in people that you know. Now, I've looked at, as I said, thousands of texts of popular environmental literature where people are confessing their environmental guilt and shame. And in this literature, some of the texts focus on really practical questions. So maybe this person goes home, writes on an environmental blog, writes a book and says, "I keep forgetting my bags. What do I do? How do I remember?" This is a question of guilt. It's action-oriented. But we also see the vast majority of these conversations are about something else, what might be called existential issues, because people's moral failings cause them to question what it means to be a person, whether they can really ever improve their actions, especially if they fail on just little things, like taking their cloth bags to the grocery store. In these cases, people are experiencing shame. Colin Beavan, author of No Impact Man, The Adventures of a Guilty Liberal Who Attempts to Save the Planet and the Discoveries He Makes Himself and Our Way of Life in the Process, longest subtitle ever, I think. He describes at the beginning of the book how he collects all of his family's trash for 4 days to try to understand how to reduce his environmental impact. And he's sorting it out in the hallway of his apartment, and he says, I didn't open the bag with the dirty diapers in it. And he's sorting through everything. And as he's doing so, he feels guilty about the huge mound of trash from just 4 days. Then he starts deepening his reflection, wondering what his grandparents who lived through the Depression would think of him now. He's concerned with his identity, what this trash reveals about him as a person. Elsewhere in the text, he alludes to the temptation to judge his character as well as that of American society and humans in general as completely problematic. He uses words like lazy ingrate or failure. He's not just thinking of somebody who messed up one time, but someone whose character is radically diminished by these problems. This focus on self-assessment, I argue, is the dominant reason that people are talking about their environmental guilt and shame, whether in popular academic literature or honestly a lot of times when people realize that I'm an environmental ethicist, they start confessing to me spontaneously, but it's just a part of the job, I guess, an unexpected part. So people do this discussion of their guilt and shame in highly emotive terms, focused on feelings, self-worth, and what's possible as a human. People who respond to these narratives, whether in environmental books like Beavan's, in blogs, discussion boards, newspaper articles, etc., typically start framing this as an issue about the human condition. People will talk about everybody making mistakes, things can turn around, you aren't a horrible person. They'll look at the whole experience of the person's life. In other words, respondents and participants try to move the focus from an assessment of global self to an assessment of particular actions. Now, at this point in talking about this research, a number of people in the past, and maybe some of you, have said, why do we care about environmental guilt and shame? Isn't this just a problem of self-centered, privileged people who are feeling bad and should just get over it? There are way worse environmental problems. I do think it can be navel-gazing in problematic ways, and I tackle that issue in the larger project. But today I'd like to emphasize that I don't think that guilt and shame are just trivial issues, because they can significantly shape the behavior of those who feel them and the experiences of many others. If we understand that environmental guilt and shame are common feelings in America today, and that they are felt by people who have environmental ideals, and that shame can hinder reparative action, then it seems likely that environmental shame can hinder environmental action, especially among those who are most concerned about the environment. In other words, the very people who consider themselves environmentally friendly or pro-sustainability or creation carers may be hindered from acting because of shame, as well as a number of other reasons. So how do we respond? I suggest it would take at least 5 factors to address shame about environmental degradation, a lack of sustainability, etc. First, we need to acknowledge that emotions are one of many influences on how people envision their lives and interact with the world. We aren't just rational automatons. Secondly, and more specifically, we need to recognize the way that shame can lead to paralysis and inaction, which can exacerbate negative physical and relational ramifications of environmental degradation, including climate change. I think we need more research about shame's effects on environmental activities in the US and around the world to understand the degree to which it is operative. But as I argued earlier, knowledge is only a piece of the problem. So we need to look to other kinds of responses. Since shame deals with the identity of the person feeling it, any sufficient response to shame must be capable of envisioning and implementing an alternative identity. We need ways of repairing self-perceptions after doing wrong, of moving from the paralysis of whole self-judging shame to action-focused guilt involving apology, reparation, restoration, and new actions. This necessitates taking seriously existential questions that are prompted by shame. It involves recognizing our limits and even failures, and envisioning these experiences are not the sum total of who we are or who we could be. Fourth, the relationality of the self-conscious moral emotions, such as shame, demands a relational response. In other words, we feel shame in relationship to someone else because of what we've done to them, because of how they might perceive us, etc. Thus, we can't deal with shame alone. We need a relational response. And fifth, as one moves from shame to guilt, one needs to take particular concrete actions to deal with the negative outcomes of our past actions. These actions are key to restorative justice, relationships with others, and our own self-concept. In other words, we need to live into these changes, not just think about them. Fortunately, there are realms of scholarship and human experience that can together address these issues. Religious studies scholarship, especially the intersection of religious ethics and ritual, and the practice of ritual and ethics in religious communities are sites of these resources. Now, Catherine Bell, a prominent scholar of ritual, rightly argues that rituals include a broad array of actions. She maintains that ritual is, at heart, quote, a way of acting to differentiate some actions from others, end quote, rather than any particular set of practices. Similarly, Jonathan Z. Smith argues that ritual is a mode of paying attention, a process for marking interest, not of blind action or habit, but of attentiveness. Now, while paying attention may suggest cognitive processing, rituals involve much more: movement, the senses, and emotion, as required by this first necessary characteristic. Rituals do not just play out preconceived notions or enable thought. They also spark new experiences of the body, emotions, and relationships, as is called to in points 3 and 4. Rituals allow participants to pay attention to experiences, things, place, their co-ritualists, and possibly the transcendent. Indeed, rituals create and maintain participants' identity. Identity may develop in contrast to non-participants, or more importantly in our case, to who participants were before they did the ritual. Communities support ritual participants in their belief and practice such that an individual's identity is bound up with that of their fellow participants. This identity formation addresses the existential questions raised by the experience of environmental shame, point 3, and it also builds relationships, point 4, and shapes the ways that people act in and outside of the ritual, point 5. Now, one type of ritual, the rites of affliction, which, to quote Bell, attempt to rectify a state of affairs that has been disturbed or disordered, is particularly relevant to environmental shame. These rites of affliction often acknowledge human limits and articulate ways to deal with them and restore hope. Bernard J. de Klerk argues that traditional Christian liturgies both, one, recognize the need for lament, grief, and confession as humans continually fail to live up to their ideals, and two, praise and hope as worshipers return to the possibility of something better. This tension ideally deals with the negative emotions associated with failure, shame, and loss, without wallowing in them. Here, as well as on the Day of Atonement in Judaism, or during processes of relinquishing desires or perceived wrongs to oneself in Buddhism, or in many other ritual practices, participants acknowledge particular and existential wrongs, maintain the worth of participants, and chart a path forward. Thus, rites of affliction directly address the questions of shame. Those particular rites of affliction that explicitly work to repair relationships respond to the fourth criteria. Insofar as rites of affliction change identity and are linked to concrete actions, for example, doing charitable acts, social engagement, etc., they can also provoke the concrete actions discussed in point 5. Finally, as rituals help people who are ashamed deal with so many aspects of their shame, they may help them move from whole self-judging shame to guilt, and thus overcome some of the denial, anger, and paralysis that can accompany shame. So in sum, rituals are the answer, or at least a big piece of it. Now you may be asking, what rituals in particular can fulfill these functions? I'd argue that many can. I don't think it's my job to say this is the one ritual for everyone. It doesn't work for an outsider to come in and force a ritual on people. They need to buy in. Those rituals need to resonate with their communities. Some religious communities may find it helpful to adapt traditional religious rituals to respond to environmental issues, including guilt and shame. One might imagine a Catholic confession involving environmental issues. The Jewish Day of Atonement might include discussions not just of typical or traditional harms against God and other people, but also environmental injustices and harm to biota. Such expansions can capitalize on the moral support already in the religious community and the notions of human nature and identity that come out of those traditions. They may also spur people to change their behavior in other parts of life, but I'd argue that those connections to concrete actions outside of the formal ritual space, like voting, advocacy, environmental restoration, recycling, or a host of other activities, should probably be connected to better enable participants to live out their non or less shameful identity. Such concrete actions can and often are also undertaken by groups who do not identify as religious, whether environmental nonprofits or just groups of neighbors or family members who are greening their lives. For such activities to sufficiently respond to shame, I'd argue, people need to do more than just act. They need to acknowledge their emotions and self-understanding that arises from them. Developing a vision of identity and human nature that accounts for this wrongdoing while also allowing for a possibility of positive action will probably also take some intentional effort. Finally, such secular organizations will be best able to deal with shame when they invite and foster long-term relationships, such that they can elicit the trust necessary for acknowledging wrongdoing in oneself and others, and the positive support that's necessary to deal with shame. In short, ritualization involving emotion, action, community, reflection about identity is necessary to respond to environmental shame. These requirements, I would argue, go considerably beyond most of the social conversations about sustainability in the literature and in activism. However, I maintain that such rituals are necessary to deal with the shame and the complex obstacles to sustainability that it poses. In sum, involving religion in the academic study of and attempts to work towards sustainability can be advantageous, both because it illuminates potential obstacles to achieving sustainability, whether ignoring normative aspects of our sustainability measurements or our experiences of environmental shame. Through ethics, visions of human capacities, and ritual, religion offers us a way to mitigate these dangers and move towards sustainability. Thank you.
We have another.
Is it on? Okay. Hello, can you hear me? So thank you so much. Maybe you could stay up there because you'll be answering questions if you don't mind. But I'll just read bullet train style a summary for anybody who came in late or would like to be reminded. And then I have a question and then we'll open it up.
Great.
So put on your seatbelts. Here goes. Sustainability is often understood in terms of environment, economics, and social, none of which are fixed targets. I'm summarizing your paper, obviously.
Yes.
Scientists use hundreds of indices, often quantitative, for assessing complex systems involved in sustainability, both nationally and internationally. The published results affect what people do. Dr. Fredericks' work has researched how justice figures into these indexes. She found that indexes often neglect the value of justice, which sadly affects the poor the most. Dr. Fredericks lists 4 steps to counter this. First, take vulnerable population information into account. Second, take local specific, not average data into account. Third, use surveys and interviews to collect qualitative data. And fourth, involve the community. She concludes this first part of her paper by noting that this brings more knowledge, but there are other factors that also need to be assessed using, for example, religion. Thus, in the second part of her paper, Dr. Fredericks focuses on emotions and religious ways to manage these problems. She focuses specifically on guilt and shame with regard to the environment, mostly in America. Generally, shame seeks to hide, guilt seeks confession and change, so a move from shame to recognition of guilt is important. These emotions in response to environmental decisions are not trivial because they can shape our responses and policy. Dr. Fredericks offers 5 solutions. First, attention to how emotions shape what we think about our lives interacting in this world. Second, undo the paralysis shame and other emotions can cause. 3, decouple identity and shame in order to take new actions. 4, recognize communal aspects of shame and communal responses. And 5, move from shame to recognition of guilt, thereby enabling rights and other salutary actions to change us. She highlights the new attentiveness, among other helpful attitudes, that religion and rights can give us. And by rights, I mean R-I-T-E-S. Rights are usually community enacted and supported, which thus sustains new identity and new ideas about how to act. Rights give us a place to grieve and transition from grief to action. Dr. Friedrich concludes, thus rituals include all of the characteristics needed to deal with environmental shame. And furthermore, religion should be included in the discussions about sustainability because they help remove environmental obstacles and create sustainable communities focused on environmental sustainability. So thank you so much for that. So I have one question and then we'll open it up. And my question is, I've coined this expression based on my reading of Shakespeare. I love Shakespeare and I do a lot of teaching of Shakespeare. It's the Claudius complex. Claudius from Hamlet. You'll remember that while praying, he wonders how he can be forgiven for his crime when he is in the lap of luxury created by the crime. He's married to Gertrude, he's king of Denmark, he's enabled to continue with his various projects. And we all face this Claudius problem in our enjoyment of our cars and the lifestyle that we live. Yep. So we may feel shame and we may feel guilt, but we also feel enormous satisfaction.
Yes.
And there's a problem with that. And Claudius talks about how it's a double direction. He wants to do something about it, but he also doesn't want to do something about it, and so he does nothing.
Right.
And his prayer goes up, but his words stay. His words go up, but his soul stays below, or something like that. Yeah. So I think we all have a little bit of that, and I just wondered, your paper is so good on shame and guilt, whether you could comment on that first. Yeah.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you so much for this elegant summary and for this probing question. I think you hit it right on the target, that people who are experiencing this shame in my study, generally middle class and upper middle class or upper class Americans, are a product of the very conditions that give rise to shame. And we tend to enjoy those things we also feel shame about. I can't tell you how many times I've been to a conference on an environmental theme and people reflect on how they feel bad that they flew there. This is a common trope. I think that this tension between being a product of and feeling bad about appropriately about these kinds of conditions is one specific example of what we might deem a part of the human condition. And figuring out how to deal with this is, I would argue, one of the perennial questions. That's not to dodge your question, but it's to put it in this larger context. I think that what you're pointing to, the satisfaction of doing all sorts of things that we also know are devastating to the environment and to many, especially vulnerable people on the earth, is another major class of things that can hinder our sustainability efforts. And a lot of people are writing very persuasively on that. I haven't looked at it quite as much because I've been focusing on the shame aspect. I think that the two are interconnected though, because I think that for people who are feeling shame, those feelings can be so nasty and the problem is so incredibly complex that it's so much easier just to keep living the exciting life that gives you as a privileged person all kinds of good things without investigating. And so I wonder if opening up spaces to talk about and to think about shame would allow us the psychological, existential, moral, religious space to deal with this, these conditions of privilege.
Great, thank you. So are there questions from the audience? There's a microphone going around, so down at the front here. Oh, sorry.
Okay.
You're next.
Hello. I want to thank you for the presentation. One of the fascinating parts of your approach in talking about indexes and indicators and the need to strengthen their ability to accomplish justice is your incorporation of qualitative data using interviews from vulnerable populations. In this discussion, you focus on the perspective of upper middle class people. And so I'm curious just to see how you balance the perspective of the upper middle class with maybe the contributions or just the insights or experiences of these populations that you hope to learn from and pay attention to in your study.
Yeah. This is a wonderful question. Thank you. It's pointing out some tensions or discontinuities between different aspects of the project, or of my work as a whole. So to give you a little bit of background before I get to the heart of your question, the two pieces that I talked about today, the environmental justice and the guilt and shame, are two different projects that I see as connected. And one of the ways that I see them as connected is that after doing all of the work on the sustainability indicators, one of my biggest questions was about environmental justice and how to improve the plight of the most vulnerable. Lots and lots of people are working in environmental justice studies on how to improve participation rates, how to make sure that people's voices are heard, why we ought to do this in terms of the dignity, rights, care about all people. And as I surveyed that literature, I found that rightfully so, it is often about the most vulnerable people, very rightly so. But I found myself then wondering, what about the people who are largely perpetuating such injustices? And I worry that I'm pretty convinced that in the long run, everybody's going to need to think about environmental injustices, about distributional aspects. And that one of the barriers to doing that is environmental guilt and shame. And so to think about guilt and shame and to have a way to deal with that is to bring people of privilege into the conversation such that they can be doing this transformation. But your question was about how to involve local populations in qualitative data collection for sustainability indexes. A lot of the most interesting research I've seen about this marries a host of disciplinary perspectives and is transdisciplinary, as we heard last night. So it's not working just with academics, but with people with all kinds of knowledge and experience. One study I read in particular, or a series of studies, is about sustainability indicators in Africa, where people are trying to monitor drought conditions in places where there is little money or infrastructure for scientific instruments to monitor water or how much the soil is holding the water or all of these sorts of things. And so after several years of scientists working with local pastoralists, they determined that the local people who had lived there for generations and generations knew that when a particular plant was less seen in the vicinity and another plant was more seen, that this was an indication that the soil was not holding much water, that the species of vegetation would change on a fairly quick move, with small plants, what we might consider weeds. And so people started using the presence of one plant or another as a signal of drought in this location, not just for the local people trying to figure out what to plant or where to move, but also as an indicator for state or international assessments of drought. And I think that this is one of many examples that we have from all around the world, how paying attention really allows local knowledge to be lifted up as the significant evidence of environmental degradation or health that it is. Now, there are challenges to doing this sort of monitoring in that it takes a lot of time to build trust with communities, to figure out what the markers are, and then once you have the markers, say a particular plant, how do you monitor that in a large-scale way? How do you make people pay attention? There are many challenges to that, but there are a lot of possibilities as well. Does that help answer your question? Okay.
Do you still have a question?
Thank you. I'm just wondering, do you have measurements of like use of garbage? So if we talk about in the United States, we have a huge pollution problem, and garbage is, if you go through whether it's a middle class neighborhood, a lower middle class, a poor neighborhood, a rich neighborhood, this is a huge impact, and the kind of food you eat, whether it's packaged or, you know, prepared by yourself. Are there measurements of this where we can, perhaps put a little guilt onto people who are, I'm just, that's my thought.
So I'm hearing
Thank
two
you.
parts of your question. One is about, is the data available? And to some extent it is. Data on what is thrown away is collected by a variety of different people, sometimes better than others, and getting good quality, reliable, comparative data across different municipalities or in different neighborhoods is sometimes complex. But there are resources for that to some extent. The next question, it sounds like, is whether we should use that data to shame people into doing things differently. I didn't talk about that today in my talk, but I have a couple of chapters in my, hopefully, upcoming book about that. There's a lot of controversy over using shame as a tactic. As I talked about today, shame can be incredibly debilitating to people. And you're asking guilt? Yeah. Good move. I think that one of the ways to differentiate between these things, which can be tricky because even if you're trying to only elicit guilt in the person, they might respond with shame. And so I argue that if you're trying to use these strategies, the only responsible, justifiable way to do it is to do it in communities where you can have significant support, where you can give people other paths forward in terms of action, and you can also help them with the questions of identity that are raised by such moves. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Hello. You partly answered the question I'm going to ask, but first I wanted to thank you for the very interesting subject that you are studying and to share it with us. I was listening to the news this morning and there was a news about, for purpose of mining, the German government had given authorization for destroying part of a forest that is full of, how do you say in English, millenary trees that are very important even for the German psyche, because I think Goethe used these trees in some of his books. So, and this happens, I know I'm French, this happens in France right now as well, in Alsace, and it happens here in the United States. For years and years, millenary trees have been destroyed in various forests and swamps here in the United States. And I think the psyche of the people must be affected by that in a way, so it's a matter of guilt, it's a matter of also of reaction. That's why I was saying that you answered the question already. In relation with the urgency of the problem of, for example, global warming in the planet, how can guilt and shame could accelerate the awareness that we need for a lot more people? Okay.
Yeah. Great question. So I was talking a little bit about this before the talk, just informally, with a colleague, and maybe strangely, I think that, or surprisingly is a better word, I think that the evidence that I've gathered about people feeling guilt and shame is in some ways a good sign, because people experiencing these emotions means that they have environmental values. If someone did not have those environmental values, they would not have that affective response to 1,000-year-old trees being cut down or threatened to be cut down. And so I think your question of how to, it sounds like your question is about how to use emotions and the psyche to get people to be concerned or to act. I think that this is a long process involving lots of different components. It involves learning various facts. It involves experience of nature. So people actually have seen these big trees and know experientially what it's like to be next to them, so that people have read the poetry that draws on them, so that people know about their religious traditions valuing of the natural world and why they might be concerned about that. And it involves people having practices of standing up for saving trees. It involves people being in communities where, if I can use the word, positive peer pressure helps, where you see someone else who is taking a stand and you can follow them, or you can ask them how to do it, or they can say, don't you want to come along to this rally, or wouldn't you like to write a letter? And you can facilitate that. So I realize that those are very general and often common strategies or tactics, but I think that that is a part of it. I think we need a multifaceted approach that acknowledges the psychological, the emotional, the physical, the thinking all together.
Yeah, first, thanks for that great talk. And it was so powerful because it spoke to all of us at individual levels, but really so many of the big environmental problems, the stage is set at an institutional level. And if the government decides to take food crops and turn them into gasoline fuel, a country in Africa decides to take prime agricultural land and lease it to China or India and let them grow palm oil or whatever. And can these tenets and these ideas, can they be taken, or do you see a way to take these ideas of guilt and shame and use them in a positive way, transferring them from individual level to institutional and government levels?
Great question. Thank you. I've thought a lot about this. Maybe 2 points I'd like to make. One is that in this talk I was, as you noted, really talking at an individual level. But in my broader research, I've demonstrated that the environmental guilt and shame that people feel is not just about their individual actions and identity, but also about their collective actions and identity. So about what it means to be an American or a person of privilege or maybe even a person in general. So there's a lot of evidence there, and I'd argue that guilt and shame at the collective level can have the same types of reparative action tendencies or paralysis that we see at an individual level. Now, we have a lot of examples of environmental shaming at a collective, corporate, or governmental level. I'm sure that many of you have heard about campaigns to shame companies that have bad environmental records. One of the most famous early examples of this was in the 80s, when many people in the US and around the world rose up against tuna fishers and tuna companies who were catching dolphins in tuna nets, and people thought this was horrible. So there were boycotts, there were lots of conversations, there was a shaming of the companies to do that. We also see examples of shaming working at a corporate or a national level in terms of environmental policy sometimes. And a number of people advocate this kind of move going forward. Jennifer Jaquette, for example, has a book that came out, I think, in 2015 called Is Shame Necessary? And she argues that this type of shaming of corporations and governments is really the way to go to transform environmental policy and environmental action, because as you point out, many of the problems are not just about one person recycling or not, they're about national, state, or international policy. There's a way in which I think these collective shaming practices can be very enticing, and they can have significant positive consequences. I'm a little worried, however, about Jaquette's embrace of these shaming tactics, because if pushed too far, shaming of collectives can have just as devastating effects as shaming of individuals. Much of the work about collective shame has come out of post-Holocaust German reflections on what it means to be ashamed for the Holocaust, not just as someone who was an adult and participating during the war, but as a child or a grandchild or now potentially a great-grandchild of those people, and the way that that affects the national psyche. There have been similar studies about a variety of horrible atrocities, which, please note, is not to minimize at all all of the other horrors of the Holocaust. But that research about collective shame in particular indicates to me that there also, at the collective level, we need to tread carefully, and we need to have systems of support if we are facilitating shame, to make sure that there are ways to rehabilitate people or to give hope and not just damning them.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It's interesting how rituals help to preserve the integrity of creation, as you rightly pointed out. And then coming from Africa, especially from Nigeria, in Africa we talk about African universe as a moral universe, or sacramental universe if you like. And then coming there you see Christianity now destroying most of these rituals in a way. And some of all these rituals, our ancestors put them in place to protect the, the environment. So Christianity, for me or for us somehow, whether they really understood what they were doing or not, did a great deal of harm to this ritual-laden area. And as a result, we have more of a desertification and the destruction of many things, animals, and it's also factoring in the way we treat human beings. So my question is, if you are to speak to African as a Westerner, as a Christian, one, how would you address that? And then secondly, what happens when a ritual or another ritual, somehow related to the first question, tends to undermine another ritual, or as you talk about, rituals are to be understood in context.
Yeah. These are great questions. Thank you. In my study of rituals and ritual theory, it seems that while often we have popular conceptions of rituals as static and timeless, unchanging, just the way they have to be, that many times in human communities, in religious communities of all sorts, rituals do change over time. They're interpreted in different ways, the types of things, motions, ideas, etc. that they involve may change. This change often comes as people within those communities find that the ritual isn't working in the way that they intend. It may have negative consequences that weren't recognized before, etc. And this change often happens from within communities. So to give an example, I was raised as a Lutheran, and in my religious communities growing up, there were questions about whether we should use inclusive language in the liturgy. This is a question that many people around the world have had conversations about, and this was a change to ritual that came about in some communities because what had happened wasn't, in their minds, fully embodying what the rituals were meant to do in liturgy, not representing everyone or not representing the divine appropriately or adequately in all of its complications and mystery. So it sounds to me like what you have is a situation where at least some people are recognizing the ways that rituals are not meeting all of, I hesitate to say meeting all of the needs of the people because it sounds so utilitarian and crass. But I mean that in the richest possible way, that it's not reflecting the theological, environmental, social realities of what people are experiencing. I think it's important to be able to recognize when rituals have had that negative effect, and to be able to empower people to think about ways of undoing or changing those possibilities. Now, granted, as a Protestant raised person, I have probably different ideas of religious authority and experience and change than some other people might. But I think that there are many ways to have that conversation from the ground up and the top down.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
I was just made aware of this book, so I haven't read it, but I was wondering if you know the work of Virginia Burrus. She's the Bishop W. Earl Ledden Professor of Religion and Director of Graduate Studies at Syracuse University, and she's the author of a book called Saving Shame, Martyrs, Saints, and Other Abject Subjects, and also a book called The Sex Lives of Saints, an Erotics of Ancient Hagiography. And she's highly praised by a number of people, but I was wondering if you knew anything about her work.
It was just recommended to me last month, and it is on my shelf to read. I have looked at the back, and that's about it. So yes, I look forward to reading Saving Shame.
Hi, Sarah, thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. And
Thank you.
I have two observations. One is about indicators and what is emerging as a sort of science of indicatorism and the kind of debilitating impacts it has on genuinely assessing sustainability in communities. So the United Nations has given responsibility for developing indicators to the census departments of individual signatory nations. And the census departments have a set of proxy indicators that they use to measure, now they're measuring sustainability with it, but they are traditional things that they've been measuring for a long time. And there is no effort to really create new, meaningful indicators. And my worry is that indicatorism is a kind of game that policymakers and scientists play to, in complex situations, to serve different interest groups. And if you look at the most indicatorized arena of our life, it's probably economics.
Oh, yeah.
It has over 3,000 indicators of economy at all kinds of levels, right? And it is probably the least understood phenomenon of human life, how economies work. So my worry is that if we give credibility to this indicatorism game, we are somehow going to detract from genuine assessment of sustainability through stories and other qualitative measures that the gentleman earlier asked a question about. So do you have any thoughts about how we might be able to address the inherent danger of indicatorism, because it sucks us into this game playing around measurement and metrics, and we lose the essence?
This is a very important question. So I fully agree that there can be a reification of indicators. These numbers are put on a pedestal. They're seen as the end-all and be-all. Any other kind of data or experience can often be just not even swept under the rug, because that involves paying attention to at least sweep. There's just nothing. I think that this is really dangerous for a whole host of reasons. As an environmental ethicist, I am engaging often with colleagues and students who are so wary of any kind of quantification or measurement, anything like that. They want to focus on intrinsic value rather than instrumental value. Bookshelves have been written about this, which is an important concept. But what I'm concerned about from my own disciplinary perspective is that there's so much pushback against indicators that relegates many environmental ethicists to not even be in the same room as many decision makers. And so I think that we need a multi-pronged approach where we both push back against the rise of indicators, and we work within the system to make it as good as we can, knowing that this is often how decisions get made. In my first book, I really took the work within the system approach, but I think that pushing back at the rise of indicators is also really important. And a part of that comes through education, so that the general public can read a news article or look at a UN report that talks about this metric is getting better and this one is getting worse, excuse me, and be able to ask the critical questions of what exactly does that number or graph mean? What data is included there? Who gets to decide? Why are they using GDP rather than something else when GDP is so flawed? What about the stories of the individual people? What about the experiences of particular communities that may have different sorts of goals? All of these questions need to be questions that we ask whenever we're encountering indicators. I think that that is a very difficult task, given how prevalent the numerical and the economic are in our contemporary world as the arbiters all too often of value and meaning. So I think that that's another place where religion, ethics, philosophy can come in to help people recognize other types of values.
I'm getting the signal that we've come to the end of our discussion time. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Dr. Fredericks, please join me in thanking her.
Thank you, Sarah, for a mesmerizing presentation, really challenging at the rational and the emotive level, a real challenge to our imaginations. Thanks, Jennifer, for facilitating the discourse. That was very nice. We're going to have a little stretch break now for half an hour, get some oxygen into our blood, some refreshments and snacks next door here, and once you've had a time to get your stretch break, I encourage you to go in here to have a look at the displays that we have, a variety with the high school students and certainly others as well. So we'll see you back here in half an hour. All right? Thank you.